Hey guys, what is up? Public here back with another video, and today we're going to talk about talent builds and kind of get into the Archon versus Voidweaver debate when it comes to Season 3. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about like the strengths and weaknesses of both, and we're going to go over like talent builds from a rating and a Mythic Plus environment for Season 3. Okay, let's dive in. Alright, so similar to last season, Shadow Priest basically gets to play both hero talents and be considered viable in pretty much all forms of content. So if you really prefer one versus the other, you can basically do that in almost anything. Now, there are caveats there of like if you're trying to really optimize and push your damage, like another 2-3%, whatever that is, there is times when one probably makes more sense over the other. So that's what I'm going to be talking about, those kind of nuanced points here. But just know that in general for this season, you can pretty much make either one work in any given situation. Now, they do have their own strengths and weaknesses, and that's kind of what I was referencing before. So depending on what kind of content you're doing, you'll kind of likely notice that one might naturally feel better than the other one. So if we go ahead and we're going to start with raid builds first. So with raiding, there is a little bit of a more dotted line here of like which one makes more sense. And the first thing is just the new tier set. So if you find yourself not having access to the new Season 3 4-piece bonus, you should pretty much play Archon all of the time. And this is just because Voidweaver baseline is just not tuned as well as Archon is. Archon does not get as much as the tier set compared to Voidweaver. Voidweaver's set bonus is like almost twice as better than Archon's. So what that means is when you actually get tier, that's when they become kind of more competitive with each other, depending on what's happening. So if you don't have the new 4 set yet, you should pretty much be playing Archon in every single fight within the raid. And this goes for regardless of your kind of Season 2 tier set status, if you have any or none of those pieces. Now, once you get the new 4-piece, that kind of unlocks your ability to start considering or trying out Voidweaver inside of the raid. So now when that actually makes sense, again, kind of depends on the fight that you're actually doing. So we talk about Mana Forge Omega, and if you haven't seen, I do have like a build guide linked in the description that kind of goes over fight by fight talent builds. A lot of these guys kind of have similar themes to what we've seen in the past with like where we like Archon versus Voidweaver. And a lot of these fights, to be honest, seem to lean towards Archon, for me at least, when it comes to like how they feel to play. And now there is a caveat with that of like right now, to make Archon really push its damage, you need to be getting pretty high duration void forms pretty consistently. Now, every single one does not need to be like a 90-second or 80-second void form, but like every other one at the very least is kind of what you need to make Archon considered viable. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go over like the full details of like how to make that happen. I do have a blog post that's linked in the description that's aimed at helping you understand how to get those big void forms. So if you are struggling with that, I would suggest giving that a thorough read through, and I'll keep updating that with more examples as we go along. Just know that if you want Archon to be considered like top end and get the full power out of it, you need to be pushing those kind of high duration void forms to really get the most bang out of your buck. Now, that being said, Voidweaver does not have that same kind of punishing type play style, right? Where you can afford to kind of make a little bit more mistakes on Voidweaver and still get good damage output. So for a lot of people, if you're just kind of getting into the raid, especially on progression, Voidweaver might make more sense just right off the bat, just to make that easier. Now, where that starts to drop is when you need to heavily target swap or there's a lot of multi-target involved. So if we kind of go down kind of the list of raid bosses here, so like Lumathar, for example, there's a lot of ads, especially in Mythic, that you need to kind of target swap and kill quickly. Voidweaver really struggles doing that like throughout the encounter. Archon can do that a lot easier. Similarly, the Soul Hunter's encounter is more or less 3 target for the majority of the fight if you stay in range with all the bosses. Archon just ends up looking usually better in this case. You know, Voidweaver's somewhat balanced around Entropic Rift, and the bosses usually aren't fully stacked to take advantage of that. So again, Soul Hunters is kind of leaning towards Archon here as well. There's a lot of other fights like Soulbinder and Voidweaver, which are kind of like ad-heavy fights. And again, Voidweaver can do okay in these situations, but Archon's ability to kind of damage a lot of enemies very easily and target swap as needed makes it really nice for those fights in particular. Now, once we get into kind of the back half of the raid, this is where those kind of big benefits with Archon don't shine as much. So Voidweaver does become more of like a practical option on these fights without losing too much. Fractalist is just pure single target. You can pretty much feel free to play either, whichever one you think you're going to be more comfortable with. Again, you're going to see if you can really pull off really high duration void forms, Archon's going to do really well on something like Fractalist. Same thing like Nexus King and Demencius. Like, these are also options we saw in the Race to World First that, they started moving more towards Voidweaver just to get a bit more like consistent, less punishing play style. That might be, make more sense for you and your team as well. So, fact of the matter is, if you're playing Shadow, you're trying to optimize in Raid, you want to have all of the Raid builds ready to go in case you want to try out something else, especially on progression. Now, when we dive into these talent builds, they're almost exactly the same. So we're not really switching talents that often throughout Raid. There are some really minor things that we can tweak, and we'll go over those real quick. But this is the default build for Archon. I do suggest taking Mindbender here, although Death Speaker is technically an option. I think Bender just makes things feel better personally. Now, when we start going into 3 target scenarios, so for the Council Boss, we basically just move 1 point around, we drop the 1 point in Phantasmal Pathogen, and we add Dark Evangelism. So it's a pretty minor optimization, but it can be, give you that little bit of extra damage because Phantasmal Pathogen just isn't cleaving in this sense. Now, if we switch gears over to Voidweaver, we're going to be taking Depth of Shadows. We have Death Speaker, a little bit of Execute of a profile here, and likewise, we're still kind of taking a very similar setup. We're just not utilizing Yogg-Saron. Now, similarly, if you want to play Voidweaver on 3 target, you definitely can. It's not my default suggestion on that boss, but it is viable for sure. And in this case, we're going to drop that point in Phantasmal Pathogen and take Dark Thoughts instead, just because, again, we want to do more damage to all 3 targets, not just the one that gets hit with the Phantasmal Pathogen damage. And these are our raid builds. It's pretty simple. We're not changing talents like we have in the past. We always take Shadow Crash. It's a nice little movement global for use. And those are our talent builds when it comes to raiding. All right, now let's cover Mythic Plus. So Mythic Plus, there's a little bit more of kind of a preference here a lot of times for folks. I will say, if you're getting into the case of like a push key versus a weekly key, that's kind of the big delineation between when Voidweaver makes more sense or Archon. And let's talk about what that means. A lot of people are like, well, what level does that start at? And the answer is it just depends on where your group is at within the season, right? Doing a plus 12 week 1 or week 2 is very different than doing a plus 12 10 weeks from now when you have like full bisque gear. The real question is, how long are packs actually living and how big are you actually pulling? Voidweaver does very, very well in that kind of weekly key mentality where you're pulling 1 pack at a time. And generally speaking, those packs are not more than like 6 to 8 targets. Once you start going above that, that's where you really want to start playing Archon, especially when they start living a long time. Because Archon plays Void Eruption and Voidweaver cannot, that kind of Void Bolt refreshing dots in AoE makes Archon just much more easier to play in those environments where you have lots of targets. You can double Shadow Crash a big pull, and then Void Bolt will sustain the dots for the duration of the pull, which is really, really nice. Voidweaver does not have the ability to do that. You're basically just relying on Shadow Crash and then Vampiric Touch outside of your burst windows, which is somewhat manageable, but once you start getting to 10, 12 plus targets, that gets really hard really quickly, and that's kind of that delineation. So if you find yourself doing what I would consider like a weekly key, where it's like, hey, we're just filling our vaults with plus 10s, that's where you can pretty much play either one. I would maybe lean towards Voidweaver as being easier and just because less punishing overall when you're, if you're doing heavy chain pulling, that kind of stuff. But then as soon as you start going to these like push key environments, like whatever that is for you, like a progression key, that's where I would lean towards, generally speaking, playing Archon. But both should be considered viable for the vast majority of players, especially if you're just doing that kind of weekly key content. Now, for the Mythic Plus build, you'll see it looks almost identical to the Raid build, and that's on purpose. We really just take the 3 target build, drop the point in Phantasmal Pathogen, and then we take Silence instead. You do have a couple choices here. If in the very rare case you feel like you don't need Mental Fortitude and Silence, you can drop one of these to get a bit more damage, which you can either choose to say, hey, I'm going to get Phantasmal Pathogen for more single target, or you can take Phantom Menace for more AoE. That is definitely an option here for Archon, but for most people, you're going to want to take both of these talents all the time. Now, if we are getting into situations where you feel like you want even more AoE damage, there is an alternate build that I do have posted in the guides as well. And this is kind of what I would consider like more like full AoE damage. So if your group happens to have a lot more single target, you can basically choose, do you want 2% more single target for the cost of 2% more AoE? Or do you want 2% more AoE at the cost of 2% single target? For the vast majority of people, I would highly suggest leaning towards that single target because a lot of people can't make that choice. But for us, if we go ahead and do, so this is Archon M plus AoE, and the guide I call it the full AoE build. This is where we take Screams instead. We drop the extra point in Shadow Crash, and we grab Instill Doubt. Again, you still have that choice of adding Phantom Menace if you want even more AoE damage, but this is that option as well. Generally speaking, I haven't played this very much so far. Maybe it comes into play a bit more, but personally, I like playing Madness Wing, which is a very strong talent for single target, so that's why I prefer playing that. Now, if we switch gears to the Voidweaver build, again, this is basically just a 3-target build, but we drop that flex point that we are moving around in the raid to make sure that we have silence and mental fortitude. Now, again, if you're in a situation where you feel like you do not want both of these, you can drop one of these for either Maddening Touch, which is kind of the like the AoE option, or you can grab Dark Thoughts, which is the kind of more single target oriented spell. So these are kind of the kind of default builds that you have for Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus, and hopefully this kind of helps you understand like when to take each one. Now, I definitely suggest, I didn't go over everything with talents and all the nuanced details. The written guides are down below. I also have a VOD channel if you haven't seen. I'm going to try to upload, like when I do Mythic Plus runs or when I kill Mythic bosses, I'll have those VODs uploaded, and I'll have that link down below as well if you want to see like full runs worth of content with like what spells I'm casting and that kind of thing. I don't ever pretend that I always play perfectly, but hopefully it gives you something to look at if you're looking to improve your character. That's all we have for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what you want to see for future videos this season down below. I can't commit to putting out a ton of videos, but I'm going to try to do my best, maybe one a week, something like that, for the stuff that's the most important. So let me know what sounds good to you guys. Big thanks to everyone that supports me on YouTube, members, and all the good stuff on there. So thanks for watching. Catch you next time.